How'd you point out? Yeah, I'm so glad. I knew he would. Oh, Holly, that is just the best thing to hear. How did you do? Okay, good. All right, well, it is good to see everybody here. Thanks so much for being here. If you're visiting, thanks for coming. We're working our way through the Old Testament. We're doing it 1 week at a time. It's really through the Bible in a year, but we're starting with the Old Testament. And so the first 26 weeks, will be on the Old Testament. And so we are on chapter 11 today. Now, as we start chapter 11, and you will see, of course, as we talk about 26 weeks through the Old Testament, obviously it's not a book a week, because we would never get through that in 26 weeks. And so we are now coming to where we will combine a few, and we do that today with Samuel. Because in the Hebrew Bible, there is no 1st and 2nd Samuel. There's just Samuel. And there is no 1st and 2nd Kings. There's just Kings. And there is no 12 books of the minor prophets. There's just one book. And so when it comes time to do the minor prophets, all 12, we'll do 12 in 1 week. So we're at that. Ezra and Nehemiah we'll do together. So we're getting to several of those. So we start with 1st and 2nd Samuel. You'll see your God statement. If you are in the notebooks, if you have a notebook and you are doing that, then you will find your God statement for 1st and 2nd Samuel. And I'll tell you what the blanks are there. Of course, if you're with us on a regular basis, you know I don't tell you what each blank is in the lesson. You can go back and do that because, of course, the answers are at the end of the lesson. But I'll tell you the blanks for the God statement, and then I'll tell you the blanks for when we do the lessons. When we get to the end of the lesson and we do the lessons from 1st and 2nd Samuel. So the God statement for 1st and 2nd Samuel: God protects, blesses, and assesses. God protects, He blesses, and He assesses. And you're going to see how that's going to play out, of course, here in Samuel as we get into the life of David. And we see God's divine protection, especially on David, how He assesses not only the nation of Israel, but King Saul, and finds, because of his rebellion, he's going to strip the kingdom from him. So God protects, He blesses, and assesses. Well, let's talk about then, get into the details of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. As I said, in the Hebrew Bible, there's just one book, Samuel. Covers a period of about 150 years. When you put the two books together, a century and a half of content that we're going to cover in about 40 minutes or so. It really begins somewhere in the neighborhood of 1120 BC. That's the timing when Samuel was born. And then it's going to go all the way through the end of David's life, which is about 970 BC. Now, of course, give or take a little there, but generally, roughly speaking, it covers about those 150 years of Israel's history. And it documents this transition that's going to happen. We have been in Judges and Ruth, and the period of the Judges was that, basically, essentially, the people were ruled by judges. These judges were really military leaders in nature, that God would raise them up to deliver His people from oppressors when they repented of their own rebellion. But now we're going to transition. We're going to see a new chapter in Israel's history. And it's going to move from that tribal period where their tribes are ruled by judges into a unified kingdom. And so all of Israel is going to be a kingdom, and they're going to be ruled by a king. And there's going to be three people who are going to be front and center in these two books. Those three people, of course, are Samuel and Saul and David. And it's not just strictly, here's one and they end, and here picks up another and they end. these three men, Samuel, Saul, and David, their lives are just woven together throughout the books, these two books. And so we're going to divide these two books into 4 parts. 2 parts will cover 1 Samuel, and 2 parts will cover 2 Samuel. And so let me just kind of just give you that quick summary. Then again, encourage you really to go back this week, sit down with your lesson, go back through, make sure all your blanks are filled in, look at it more closely, go to the passages that you'll find in the body of the lesson. Use your Bible and look at it much more closely. Jot down any notes that you have, any thoughts that you have there in the margins. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the first of 4 parts of these 2 books. The first part is the rise of Samuel. Now, about 2 weeks ago on Sunday night, I actually did a lesson on Hannah. You might remember that if you were here. And so this is going to sound familiar to you if you were here a couple of Sunday nights ago. But the whole book of 1 Samuel begins in the closing days of the Judges, and the real spotlight at the very beginning is on this woman who's struggling with infertility, and it's just a terrible time for her, and she's begging God for a son. And of course, she promises that if God would grant her request, then what she would do is she would surrender her son to God and the service of God for all of the days of his life. And so God graciously granted her request. He granted her request, and so the great prophet Samuel was born. And but interestingly enough, not only was Samuel a prophet, but he's also one of the judges, one of the last judges of Israel. And so he was kind of a judge prophet, if you will, judge-prophet. And so as far as context goes historically, we saw throughout the book of Judges that neighbors would rise up from time to time. And it might be the Moabites, it might be, the Amorites, it might be the Philistines. Well, in Samuel's day, it was the Philistines again. So the Philistines are rising to power. They are a scourge in Israel's side. And so in one crucial battle with the Philistines, the Israelites decide what they need to do to prevail is they need to bring the Ark of the Covenant to the battlefield. And the reason that they do that is they kind of view the Ark of the Covenant as a magic wand. That whoever has it, they can control God. God responds to whoever, like the genie responds to whoever has the magic lamp. They kind of have that view, that magical view of the Ark of the Covenant. Well, they're wrong. And so the Ark's not about that. It's not about portents and charms and magic. It is about God's presence. That's what the Ark is about. And so God allows the Philistines to defeat Israel and capture the Ark. Now, of course, the Philistines, as a pagan people, with the Ark in their possession, they believe that it shows that the God of Israel really doesn't have power. At least he doesn't have the same kind of power that their gods have. He doesn't have the power to defend his people. He doesn't have the power to defend his honor. And so they do what is a very common ancient Near Eastern custom, and that is you take the gods from your defeated foes, and you put their gods in the temple of your gods. And it shows that your gods are superior to their gods. Well, Israel may be subject to the Philistines now because of their own rebellion and disobedience, but God certainly is not subservient to the chief god Dagon of the Philistines. And God's going to make that very clear. And so you remember what happens. The Philistines get up in the morning and Dagon's on his face there. And, it basically is an image of Dagon bowing down to the ark, which symbolizes the presence of God. And so God's making it very clear that no, Dagon, anything bows before me. And so they get real scared. God unleashes, suffering on the Philistines, and they send the ark back to Israel. And basically what happens when the ark comes back to Israel, it's popped into storage. and it's kind of removed from national life of Israel for a while. And so that goes on for about 2 decades, for about 20 years. So after about 20 years, Samuel senses the times, pretty ripe for spiritual revival. And so, he calls on Israel and he tells them that, look, the reason you're oppressed by the Philistines is your rejection of God. They respond to his preaching, and they ditch the idols. They pledge themselves to God, and God responds then in chapter 7 by leading the Israelites in a rout of the Philistines. So it's kind of a replay of the book of Judges, that same cycle, which makes sense because, again, Samuel is the last of the judges. And so you see that. So that's the first part of the 4 parts of the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. The second part there on page 66 is, you can describe it as the fall of Saul and the rise of David. Well, when Samuel gets old, the people of Israel decide they want a king. They want to be like everybody else. And so Samuel's not happy about that. In fact, he's really angry about it. God tells him, look, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Give them what they want. And Samuel says, okay. And God says, but you need to tell them, you need to warn them how life under a king is. And it's not always what it seems to be. They're going to take your sons to war. They're going to tax you to the hilt. We don't know how that works. And so that's all right. That's all right. We want a king. We want a king. We want a king. And so Samuel anoints Saul, and Saul becomes the first king of Israel. And everything looks good at first. Saul really, at the very beginning of his life as king, there's a couple of episodes that we really don't have time to talk about that really demonstrate that he's an impressive man. He has a sense of fairness. He has a sense, there's a sense of humility there. He's tall, he's good looking, he's courageous. He's everything that you would want in a king. When anybody looks at him, they go, that guy's kingly. And so that's how it started out, but it didn't last long. Things went south pretty quickly. And really Saul's downfall is wrapped around a couple of significant, it's not the only issues, but 2 major acts of disobedience. One, they're going into battle against the Philistines, and Samuel says, I'll be there at a certain time and offer the sacrifices. And Samuel's not there on time, and so Saul's not going to wait anymore. And so he decides that what he's going to do is he's going to personally offer the sacrifices. And Saul doesn't have any right at all to do such a thing. Oh, well, they had no problem fighting the Israelite. The question was, after God slapped around the Philistines a little bit, why did the Philistines then want to come back and fight Israel? Didn't they learn their lesson? No. Since when in human history do people learn their lesson? Seriously. Since when? Never. And so keep in mind, this is about 20 years has passed. And so they're, the Philistines are still strong. I mean, okay, now we're stronger. We sense weakness here. They got reports probably of the turmoil, the political turmoil in Israel, and all of this stuff is happening. And it was really important. You want to, the Philistines are on the coast. The Israelites are in the mountains. And there's these valleys that go from the coast to the mountains, and they're extremely fertile. And there's like 5 of them that go up through there. And those were the battlegrounds because whoever controlled those had a huge economic advantage for their people. And so, people were always fighting over resources. And so the Philistines weren't going to just sit back and abandon precious resources. And so the fighting would continue, and it would go on. And so that's what happened. They assessed that they would be able to defeat the Israelites, and so they went into battle against them. And, there were times when they did defeat the Israelites, when God wasn't with them. But, of course, when God's with them, it's a different story. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, you're going to see. I hate that. I'm sorry. She saw 2-letter Y's. Yeah, you're going to have to kind of work. I only proofread this 4 times and didn't see it. I sent a letter. I had to send a letter for somebody yesterday on something, and I read it 6 times. And then Leila goes, "Hey, let me see that letter you sent for him." And I showed it to her, and she goes, "You left the word met out." And I go, "What? What?" And so it's just how it is. And so, listen, I don't have an editor. If any of you would like to volunteer to be my editor and give me about 6 hours a week free, I would appreciate that. And then, but yes, I'm so sorry. I have already seen, look, there's not a parenthesis that closes the second part. I see all of those. So, yeah, and some I don't see. After we finish this and I go back to edit and change it for book thing, then hopefully a lot of these will disappear. But yeah, sorry about that. Jay. Yes, yeah, right. That's right. Good point. Good point. Okay, to what now? Z, okay. Z is kingdom. Z is kingdom. Or if you want, yeah, throne, same idea, throne, but it's a kingdom. That's what the word I had in mind. But either word like that, yeah. Okay. As you're looking at your answers later on, do the best you can. Do the best you can. And if you can't figure it out, come talk to me, and we'll figure it out. So let's get back to it. So you got this first moment of disobedience, and because of that, Samuel says, "You're done. God's done with you." That was just such a defiant rebellion. He's done with you. And so the kingdom is going to be taken from you. And that didn't mean instantly he was gone. It just meant no heir of his would sit on the throne. And instead, this is where God says, "I'm going to appoint a man after my own heart." Well, the second, of course, act of disobedience that reflected just how far Saul had drifted spiritually was that moment when Samuel brings him this direct order of God. Go to the Amalekites, wipe everybody out. And Saul goes and wipes everybody out except Agag and destroy everything. And he destroys all of the worthless booty, but he keeps the good stuff. And so, Samuel comes back, confronts him with it. Saul tries to justify his disobedience. And it's at that moment that Samuel utters those incredibly famous words, "To obey is better than to sacrifice." To obey is, and that kind of nicely follows along with our lesson this morning. To obey is better than sacrifice. So, and of course, the man after God's own heart, of course, we know who he's talking about. So it's that time God has been preparing to raise up this young, insignificant shepherd, and his name's David. David doesn't look like, Saul looked like a king, and everybody looked at Saul and went, "That's a king," because he's tall and good looking and courageous, and just every attribute that we would picture in a king he's got, and everything that we think about kingly fits the portrait of Saul. And David, really none of that fits. And now David is good looking, we're told that later, but in terms of all this size and significance and family and all, but God sees what man doesn't see. And what God saw, of course, in David was this intensely humble man, and this man who had just this radical heart for God. And that's what God's looking for. And so you then start in chapter 17, probably the most famous chapter in the book of 1 Samuel. That's the Goliath episode, and that starts this cascade of victories and fame. And so David's star is rising, and Saul is descending into madness. And in his jealousy, Saul is absolutely consumed with getting rid of David, who is a threat to his throne. And and he just he's consumed with murder, and so he just begins to hunt David. And he hunts him, and David has to go on the lam. And so while David is on the run from Saul, you can see David's godly character. His godly character is there in occasions where he has the opportunity to take Saul out, but David won't do it. David won't raise his hand against God's anointed, and so David just has to stay on the run and stays a step ahead of Saul. You can read about these adventures of this fugitive in 1 Samuel, and until eventually the time comes until Saul and his sons die in battle with the Philistines. And that's at the end of or at the end of 1 Samuel. Philistines are at it again. The Philistines are the thorn in the side of the Israelites for a long, long time. And they met there in the valley of Jezreel, at the foot of on the far eastern side of it, at a place called Mount Gilboa. And that's where Saul and his sons were killed. And their bodies were hung on a nearby city called Beit She'an, the walls of Beit She'an. And so that ended Saul's life. Well, that brings us to the third section of Samuel, and that is the success and the sin of David. So 2 Samuel picks up after Saul dies, and you've got this few years of civil war that starts it, because not everybody, is enthused with David. You've got, Saul's loyalists, and so there's this short period of war, about 7.5 years. That doesn't sound short, I know, but in the great scheme of things. But then finally, all of the tribes come together, and they agree to pledge their allegiance to David as the king, and so that's what he does. That's what happens. Now we have unity again, and David's first act is to conquer Jerusalem. There was a Canaanite group called the Jebusites who controlled Jerusalem at the time, and so David conquered it. It became known as the City of David, and that was going to become his political capital, which was really a kind of a genius thing to do because of its geographical location. Made it perfect to be, because it kind of was on the boundary between the northern tribes and the southern tribes. And so it was a kind of just a genius political move, Jerusalem. And so, but not only is it going to be the political capital, David also wants to make it the spiritual capital. Now, for that to happen, he's got to get the ark back. Remember when the Philistines sent the ark back, I said it basically went into storage, and it went there for a couple of decades. And David wants to not only bring the ark back, he wants to build a temple for God, a permanent home for the ark to dwell. God's response to David is basically, thanks but no thanks. I'm going to let your son build a temple for me, and I'm going to establish his throne forever. Now, this is one of those interesting passages in the book, because David's going to later apply that to Solomon, and rightly so, because on one level, it is talking about the fact that God is going to grant Solomon that opportunity to build the temple. But there's a deeper prophetic meaning there. And we learn about that deeper prophetic meaning when we get into the New Testament. And when we get into the New Testament in Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 5, it quotes a portion of this text and applies it to Jesus. When he says, I'm going to establish your throne forever, David did not know exactly, obviously, what God was talking about. But we know, because we're looking back to the Old Testament through the lenses of the New Testament. And so you have this wonderful messianic prophecy there. Well, it's important to know, because it's a significant event in the history, in 1 and 2 Samuel, and in David's life, and it's a significant event in all of Bible history, and that is his first attempt, of course, to move the ark from where it was back to Jerusalem, resulted in one of the most shocking moments of the Bible. And that, of course, is when Uzzah reaches out, because the ark's about to slide off the cart that it's being carried in, and he touches the ark. He's trying to protect it. It's very well-meaning, and Uzzah dies. David doesn't know what to do. He aborts the mission, and he's angry. He's scared, the ark just stays put. David goes back and tries to figure out what goes wrong. Well, you know, as we look at that event, it's an important lesson. David needed that lesson. People of God continually need that lesson, and that is God expects loyalty, covenant loyalty. And he expects it even from David. David doesn't get a pass when it comes to covenant loyalty. God expects all of his people to be obedient to the covenant, to conform to the covenant. And so eventually David's going to figure it out, because he's going to go back and he's going to open the Torah, the law, and he's going to read. This is about 3 months later. We don't really have it. I don't really have it in here, but he's going to read, and he goes, and he calls the Levites, and he goes, oh, this is the reason God's anger was poured out on us. We weren't carrying the ark right. He told how the ark was to be carried. It was to be carried by these people, and there was to be gold poles through these little golden rings at the base of the ark, and that's how it was supposed to be done. And so it was a moment of restoration, if you will. This truth about carrying the ark had been lost. And now when David did some Bible study, found out how the ark was to be carried, and went back and they brought the tabernacle back home. Well, God is going to bless David, and there's just going to be a lot of successful campaigns against a lot of the ites there, the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Edomites, and their land is going to become a part of his empire, and the empire of Israel is going to reach its zenith under David. And in fact, it's going to be for the first time, really, and the last time, that most of the possession of the land is going to, that Israel's going to have it. And so everything is great. Everything is wonderful. And then 2 Samuel chapter 11 comes. And man, David goes from pinnacle, and suddenly he just tumbled from that pinnacle into sin. And he makes this terrible choice. As you've heard me say before, it is the second most famous sin in all of the Bible. The first most famous sin is Adam and Eve. And it is the second most famous sin. He sees one of his favorite officers and one of his most courageous officers. He sees his wife taking a bath one night. And he stood there and he watched, and the more he watched, the more inflamed he became, and soon his passion became an unstoppable force. And he summons her, he has sex with her, and she gets pregnant. And so he tries to cover up the whole affair by plotting and engineering her husband's death, and then he marries her, Bathsheba, of course. And God's going to confront David with it. David thinks he's gotten away with it, but through the prophet Nathan, of course, he comes to David. The thing about David, and this is different than Saul, Saul justified, when he was confronted by Samuel, Saul justified his disobedience. David doesn't. That's a difference in their hearts. David owned his sin, and so he threw himself on God's mercy. He finds forgiveness. But even though he found forgiveness, it didn't erase the consequences. And the consequences just, from that moment on, basically, the whole family started to fall apart, and the whole nation started to struggle. One of his sons sexually abuses a half-sister of his. And then another son, Absalom, has the sexual perp assassinated his brother. And then he has to leave and flees. And then he comes back and leads a rebellion against David. And he gets a significant following, and things look kind of precarious for a while. David even has to flee for a second time in his life. And it's just terrible. At the end of the day, David's throne is spared, and but his heart's crushed, because the son that led the rebellion that tried to overthrow his dad in a coup was killed with 3 spears through the heart. And so that ends the third part of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Then we come to the last part, and it's really kind of like an epilogue or an appendix chapters 21 through 24 of 2 Samuel. And what it is, it's not in any kind of chronological order. It's things that come from the contents come from different periods of David's life. And you have this, in chapter 21, you have this decision that Saul makes that's a sin. And in chapter 24, you have another act that David takes that's a sin, where he counts the people, census. And the point seems to be that the fallout of sin is immeasurable. It's just a reminder. The fallout of sin is immeasurable. It's kind of like, a nuclear meltdown. It just keeps going. And once cleanup is okay, it's not okay to move back to Chernobyl in 6 months. It's just not. It just continues for a long time. And that's how sin is. And that's the message that we see in chapters 21 and chapter 24. It doesn't matter who made who did it. Saul, whether he made the bad decision or whether David made the bad decision, those sinful choices hurt people, and they continue to hurt people. They continue to bring harm to the family and harm to the nation. That's the point. And then, of course, in chapters 22 and 23, you have the final songs of David's life. And you see God being extolled as David's rock, his fortress, his deliverer. Worship is clearly at the center of David's life. And in those beautiful psalms there, he confesses that God gets all the credit. Every good thing that has happened in his life is because of God. And that is the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel in a nutshell. Let's take a look at the lessons. Boy, there's a lot of lessons in Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. I picked out about 10, but I could have picked out about twice that many. But real quickly now, and I'll tell you the blanks here for you. And you're on page 69 if you have the notebooks. The first bullet statement, the first blank is silent. The lesson's this: God is there and he's not silent. We see that in the whole story of the narrative in 1st and 2nd Samuel. God's very active and he's very involved in the world. He's still working. He still causes things to happen. Romans 8:28. God is there and he's not silent. We see God at work, and we see God working all throughout the saga of Samuel and Saul and David. God's fingerprints are all over it. The second lesson here, your second bullet statement on page 69, one blank, that word is providentially. Providentially. The lesson is this: God's work is normally done providentially. We all probably have some charismatic friends who still believe that God works through miracles. I don't. I'm a cessationist. I don't believe that God works through miracles. But a lot of times our charismatic friends hear that and they go, "Oh, you don't believe God works?" No, you didn't hear me. God works just as much as God's always worked. But God can work in different ways. Sometimes he can assert his power directly and do something unnatural, instantly, that can only be explained as a God event. That's a miracle. Miracles were never the norm. Miracles clustered around great Bible events. And usually those Bible events involve the bringing of revelation. If a person comes and says, "I've got a message from God," God proved it. This is my messenger. But the age of miracles is past, but the age of God working is not. God's there and he's not silent. He still works, but he still works providentially. And here in the whole 1st and 2nd Samuel, you can see God even working providentially. Listen, David didn't show up at the battlefield when he showed up in 1 Samuel 17 just by accident. You see, and David was at the right time, that it wasn't a lucky shot that when he sent that stone screaming through the air. It wasn't a lucky shot. You see God's work all the way through it. And God's work that we need to understand is normally done just beyond our ability to see him working. He usually works quietly. He usually works invisibly, but he is working nonetheless. And so we're reminded of that God's work is normally done providentially. Your third lesson here, look at their third bullet statement there. There's two blanks here. First blank is start, second blank is finish. A good start doesn't guarantee a good finish. Saul, as I said earlier, looked so promising in his early days, and unfortunately by the end of his life, he's just an absolute moral and spiritual disaster. And if we neglect our hearts, our end's going to be a disaster too. A good start does not guarantee a good finish. We have to be vigilant. We have to guard our hearts. We have to protect our hearts. We have to grow our faith. We have to draw closer to Jesus Christ. We have to cultivate. We have to weed. We have to fertilize. And so we are aware a good start doesn't guarantee a good finish. Your fourth lesson here, fourth bullet statement there on page 69, one blank, mistreat is the blank. People may mistreat us and we're not to blame. You know, what did I do? Why would a person do this to me? Well, what did I do? Well, the answer may be you didn't do nothing. And, Saul made David's life miserable, but it wasn't David's fault. David was faithful, he was humble, he was loyal, he was trustworthy, he was hardworking, he was reliable, he was productive, and Saul still abused him. That is life in a fallen world. And that leads us, of course, to the fifth bullet statement here, our fifth lesson. Your blank here is faithful. When others turn against us, God is faithful. God is faithful. We can take comfort in knowing that God is with us. There in 1 Samuel chapter 18, and I've given you 3 verses here in chapter 18. While David is dealing with a king who is just plunging into madness and has murder increasing on his mind, those 3 verses say, and God was with David. And God was with David. And God was with David. And so we need to remember that, as God's people, God remains faithful even when others around us aren't. And that leads us to another lesson that's related to that. Your next bullet statement, your blank there is the word mistreat. Again. When others mistreat us, how do we behave? Well, we keep behaving the way God wants us to behave. That's how we do it. When it came to David, there was no eye for eye stuff. It was, he continued to be loyal, he continued to be faithful, and, Saul's behavior was reprehensible, but David didn't, he didn't lower himself to the same kind of reprehensible behavior. And so we're reminded of that. The next lesson here, the last bullet statement on page 69. Your blank here is pride. Pride is evil. Pride causes people to do really stupid things. It just does. And pride causes people to sink to unimaginable depths. It just does. And it truly is, I think the best description I've ever heard of pride is it is a spiritual cancer. And I think that is absolutely right. It's a spiritual cancer that can destroy everything that it touches. It can destroy love. It can destroy contentment. It can destroy common sense. Pride can destroy everything that it touches. And so, it convinces us that we're in competition with everybody else, and we don't like it when people have something that we don't, whether it is admiration, whether it is power, whether it is material things. We just don't like that. That's pride. And so Saul didn't want David, to be more popular than him, and to potentially have his throne, and all of that just ate Saul up. And so pride is an evil thing. It's an evil thing. Last lesson on page 69, last bullet statement there, one blank, the word faith. When the bottom falls out of life, don't lose your faith. When the bottom falls out, don't lose your faith. When David's world collapsed, he knew that God's going to help him to recover. He didn't turn on God. He's running all over that place. He's going to, even has to go into Philistia. And he's running out of places to hide. But he never turns on God. He continues to obey without any kind of reluctance. He takes his family to the king of Moab to put him in protective custody. And he says at one point, he goes, I want to see what God is going to do for me. It's just amazing. So David's life's crumbling all around him, but he doesn't lose his faith. He continues to trust God all through the storm. And that's such an important thing for us to really hold on to. The next bullet statement, God cares about the details is the blank. God cares about the details of his covenant. Well, we talked about that. That was the whole Uzzah episode. David learned the hard way to be attentive to the details. And after Uzzah dies from teaching the ark, David learns to seek God's will for everything. And there you'll find at the end of that, that's that passage in 1 Chronicles where David goes home and does Bible study and finds, now I see how we were supposed to carry it. And so that's important. The next bullet statement, one blank, obedience. Something we were talking about today. Obedience is still at the top of God's list for his people. That wasn't just an Old Testament thing. We get to the New Testament. Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments. It's still at the top of his list for his people. Luke 6:46. Why do you call me Lord and not do what I say? It's still at the top of God's list for his people. And then the last one that I have down here, last lesson, the blank is Christ. David prefigures Christ. Oh, okay, yeah. There was another, there was another lesson that I had here that I had to take off. I told you there's more lessons. And the reason I had to take them off, and the reason I don't have many blanks in the last few bullet statements, is I ran out of space. I can't go more than 6 pages per lesson because it kind of throws everything off. And so I ran out of space. And so I was, boy, I really kind of messed up this lesson. Sorry about that, folks. But I'll tell you what that lesson is, and you can put it in your little, you can add it up there, okay? You can add it up there. Forgiveness doesn't mean there's no consequences. There you go. Forgiveness, when we make bad choices, when we sin, we can find forgiveness anytime we come to God. That doesn't mean we're going to be immune from the consequences of our decisions. We may have to bear the consequences of our decisions for the rest of our lives. Like I said, when David was forgiven, Nathan said, you're forgiven, but the baby's going to die. Sword's never going to leave your house. Those are just the consequences that David had to live with. And so, sometimes the consequences are like that. But real quickly, one more minute. We got 1 minute, and then we got this thing. David prefigures Christ. David came from Bethlehem. He was very obscure. He didn't look kingly. And God brought him to the most extraordinary position of all. And under his rule, Israel blossomed. Well, there was another obscure man from his line that came from the same place, Bethlehem, who there was nothing about him that seemed kingly. And God brought him to the most extraordinary position of all. And under him, Christ, true Israel, which is the church, true Israel will blossom and never be the same. Well, there you go. Now, go back, read 1st and 2nd Samuel. What wonderful narrative. Reread the lesson. Jot down any notes and thoughts and impressions you have in your space there. Look up the key passages. Do the same. Make a little note, observation about each key passage. Sorry about the extraordinarily large numbers of mistakes in this one. I'm going to try better. Thank you, David. That's probably true. That's a good point. Touche. Listen, so great to see everybody here. I hope all of you enjoy this beautiful day and can't wait to see you tonight at 6 o'clock.